Hello there, welcome back to the channel. This is Nerd World, and today we're going back to the mirror universe and a theory of mine that I've been meaning to cover. I have recently, today actually, done a blog on this on my website, which hopefully I'll remember to link below, or possibly in a card, probably more likely below if I remember. And it's on my theory as to a chain of events that may have led to the ultimate fall of the Terran Empire in the mirror universe. But before I get into it, please like, share, subscribe, and comment down below. And let's get started on this video. Now, before we fully get into this, to understand why the Empire fell, we need a little bit of backstory, put it in context. What exactly was the Terran Empire? The Terran Empire was a political and military entity that existed in the Alpha and Beta quadrants as a power of an interstellar species that existed from the 2060s through at least through to the 2290s. So about 240 years approximately the Empire would thrive. It possibly, based on language, certain elements of the culture, iconography, and certain references made by certain individuals of the Empire, probably had its origins in the ancient Roman Empire on Terra, in their universe. Them making references to things like the beliefs in democracy and other such things have long been abandoned by the Terrans as a bad idea, indicates that in their universe things like the Athenian democracy and stuff just didn't take hold, and their empire, the Roman Empire, flourished in one form or another right the way through to some form of unification that happened after the Third World War, which resulted in the political entity known as the Terran Empire becoming the dominant power on Earth, or would at least reconstitute itself as the Terran Empire, with its first conquest being the Vulcans. The Terran Empire seemed to rule somewhat by proxy, allowing many of its subject states to still operate and maintain their own forces under some kind of Terran leash. But this, of course, was a very short one. To me, this implies that the Terran Empire operated a bit like the Dominion, which in original storytelling for Deep Space Nine was meant to be a dark reflection of the United Federation of Planets, with more than just the Jem'Hadar and Vorta on their ships. But I digress. The Terran Empire seemed to operate along these political lines. It would integrate many of the races that it conquered into its own faction, swaying them to their ideological beliefs, and even allowing them to join Starfleet, some of them even rising to quite high ranks, although that was fairly unusual. Now, the Terrans as a whole were a human-centric society, but were more than prepared to utilize resources and assets from other civilizations. Similar to the Dominion, they would simply were quite content in many ways to just hold sway over other civilizations with just the simple threat of force, without needing to really put in place military overlords. Only with more belligerent races would they do this, or take more extreme measures such as totally exterminating a species, or completely enslaving it. So this tells me that the Terran Empire had to be more complex than what we give it credit for. So we fast forward to the era of Empress Georgiou. Now, we know from dialogue between her and some of her peers that she was the absolute ruler of the Empire, and she was able to appoint people to political positions at will, as demonstrated when she simply slaughtered her entire, I'm assuming, council at her court for simply knowing about the existence of the Federation, only leaving one alive and promising him, "I'll make you the governor of Andor if you keep your mouth shut." Now, that kind of level of absolute authority is indicative of the French Republic or the ancient Roman Empire, so definite connections to one of these empires is instantly in that. But anyway, now, with her, it was also noted that she'd made particularly vicious enemies of the Klingons. Under her administration, the Terran Empire had expanded. It had grown larger and more bloated than the Federation. It had possession of ships such as the ISS Charon that were powerhouses of technology and were wonders to what the Empire could achieve if it put its mind to it. Mostly destructive, but nonetheless. Now, this meant that the Terrans were in a good position to dictate terms when dealing with other powers. Of course, they had annexed the Klingons into the Empire, but the Romulans were still an independent power, as were others. There's no indication that they ever directly conquered the Cardassians or brought them into the fold of the Terran Empire. So the future alliance was still the potential to be out there. One thing that was known is all these powers hated Empress Giorgio. Before, they may have just been enemies of the Empire, but they had a particular disdain for her in particular. She ruled with absolute authority, but was often seen as being aloof and distant, deciding to rule her empire somewhat from a floating palace in space rather than on Earth, where traditionally emperors had ruled from. Now, when Lorca rebelled against her with the aid of Michael Burnham and, of course, others within Starfleet, this would not have been a unique occurrence, as something similar had happened with Empress Sato, the prior Empress Sato in the past. But all the same, this was still a pretty big upheaval. Basically, the daughter of the Empress and one of her highest ranking and most trusted officials had turned against her, as well as many other members of her government, which may have been what persuaded her to decide to stop being on Earth, because perhaps she felt she was too vulnerable in the old Imperial Palace and needed something a bit more defensible. And a starship was mobile, and more powerful than anything in the fleet, and was also not a static target on a planet's surface. Now, Lorca, of course, in short, his rebellion, his coup failed. Burnham was killed, so the Empress's daughter is dead. Lorca is then killed in a failed assassination attempt of the Emperor, along with most of his followers who were left. In addition to that, the Empress, as I previously mentioned, had wiped out several leading members of her court. Now, it's likely that much of her government was still back on Earth. Senators and other such people would have still been running the day-to-day machinations of the Empire, but the Empire was ruled by an Emperor. Now, when Giorgio seemed to be killed, or was killed, depending on which continuity in the Empire happens, it leaves a power vacuum, because instantly in her wake, her daughter, who would have been her natural successor, gone. Members of her government who could have maintained or kept stable or maybe even stepped into the role in her stead were instantly dead, because she'd killed them. Lorca, a man who had the favour of much of the people and the support of many members of Starfleet, was also dead. There was no natural succession. Now, we know when this thing used to happen in the ancient times in the Roman Empire, you had eras like the Year of the Four Emperors and the turmoil of the 3rd century AD, where the empire just tore itself apart under different emperors, rising and falling. Emperor Constantine, Magnus Maximus, you name it, they kept rising and falling, different emperors all the time. So you would have had something of a power vacuum, with lots of powerful, influential people deciding, you know what, I should be emperor. My granddad was her granddad's cousin or whatever, and it's like, I've got a claim to the throne, and then you'd have members of Starfleet that might make a move as well. So in the end, you end up with this power vacuum, and then we fast forward a few years. The next time we really see the Empire is when Kirk goes there. And we only get a glimpse of it, we only get a tiny snippet. Now, there could have been an element of this is just how Kirk ran his ship, but the fact that the flagship of Starfleet had gone from being the Sharon to being it may have been an upgraded one, for all we know, but let's assume it was a standard stock Constitution-class battlecruiser. Nothing particularly special about it. Now, the ship was not weak, it was still powerful, and clearly the Empire was still devastatingly effective, but Spock was already making predictions that the Empire was too bloated, too big, overextended, and was going to fall probably in the next 100 and plus years. So change was needed. Why? What else convinced Spock of this? Now, in my opinion, Kirk just simply ran a bad ship. He was so aggressive and so vicious towards his crew, he incited rebellion against him. Moving up in the ranks by assassinating your superiors is not a viable way to run any navy or military. On occasion, you can, but there are instances in the Marinos where it's shown they have to justify it, like when Archer rebelled against Forrest. He still had to justify his mutiny. If he'd been deemed that his mutiny was not in the favour, if Forrest had been truly determined to be acting against the Empire, or Archer was shown to be just letting his ambition get the better of him, then Archer probably could have been executed. Forrest was put back into power after Archer's mutiny. But Archer was not demoted, he wasn't taken off the ship, at least not immediately. Who knows what would have happened long term. Now, of course, Forrest tried to have him killed, but the point is, the Empire doesn't function like that. We don't give the Terrans enough credit for how complex they were as a culture if we just assumed that every day was a battle for survival and you were constantly watching your back for the person with a blade. Now that may have been what was happening at certain times, at certain places within Starfleet in particular, but it might not have been the day-to-day norm across the Empire. So that level of upheaval at the top levels of the government might not have been something the people were so willing to accept. And the constant swapping and changing of emperors, or possibly even the deconstruction of their governments, may have even brought in the concept of a constitutional monarchy, something the Terrans may have had to do in order to maintain stability, which might explain why when Spock came with all of his promises of stability and peace and an end to endless war, the Terran people, who would have been the most important ones for him to sway, were much more willing to listen, which might have explained why an individual like Spock, who was only half Terran, was able to rise to the rank of Emperor in the first place, because he was half a conquered slave race. So why would the Terrans allow Spock to become their Emperor, member of Starfleet or not? Clearly there was enough people within Starfleet and enough senators and other people that respected Spock's position, and the only reason these people, who would have grown up in a society that respected strength above all else, would have even listened to such ideologies if they'd had to go through a hell of a lot of crap in the last few years. And the beginning of that, I believe, was Georgiou's death, because she didn't leave a clear line of succession. It was not mentioned at any time did she ever mention she had any biological children. There was only Burnham. That would have meant Burnham was the natural successor. Now if there was another man or woman or individual who was earmarked for succession, that person may have been aboard the Charon when it was destroyed. Or she maybe hadn't thought of anyone else other than Burnham taking that position when Burnham turned on her, which, bear in mind, was only about a year before her own death in the Mirror Universe. It's reasonable to conclude that there was no clear line of succession. What happens whenever there is an open spot at the top? People start fighting for it. You would have had elements of Starfleet supporting different leaders, which would have maybe brought Starfleet to blows with other Starfleet officers. Even ship-to-ship combat might not have been out of the question. Civil war could have been a potential outcome of that. And that could have led to the instabilities that we saw aboard the original Enterprise, where crew members were just, it was sort of the norm for them to be turning on each other, because for the last 20 years or so, that's what things had just been like in the Mirror Universe. Starfleet had devolved into this barbaric savagery, which wasn't what we necessarily saw the Terrans behaving like when we visited the Mirror Universe every time before that. But again, that could have just been a reflection of how Kirk ran his ship. He could have been a ship captain in that universe. Who knows? Either way, it's an interesting theory, and those are my thoughts on it. That was my theory. What do you think of it? Let me know in the comments below. And again, check out the blog, because I did this in a blog as well, which might articulate a little better than I've done in this video. And that should be linked in the description below, as is all of my socials, which Twitter and Instagram, which I kind of use occasionally. Check them out. And follow and like or whatever on all of those things. And there's also a Patreon down there, which I just have to start remembering to mention, because I am trying to grow, and if I want to grow this channel and my other channels that are again linked in the description below, I do need to start pulling myself away from some of my other work and being able to utilize this as at least some sort of income to help me get better equipment and other such things. I did manage to buy myself a better microphone, which was a big thank you to the people that did donate for that purpose. But anyway, with that out of the way, if you made it all the way to the end of this video, thank you for watching, and bye bye.